Good evening and welcome to our next webinar. We are just going to give it 1 minute and then we're going to get started. Yes. All right. Let me share my screen here for you folks. Okay. And we're going to do that full screen. All right. Hopefully, um, that's coming up in a second. There we go. All right. There we are. Good evening and welcome to our webinar on affirming multiracial identity in the early years. This workshop is part of our reflective practitioner course, Seeing Ourselves, Seeing Each Other, Nurturing Healthy Identity in the Early Years. Each month, we discuss how to affirm the identity of a particular racial and ethnic group. As a reflective practitioner theory subscriber, you have access to the live webinar, the recording, the reflective workbook, and the resources. My name is Denisha Jones, and I'm the executive director of Defending the Early Years. And tonight, my guest and co-presenter is early childhood educator and author Makai Kellogg. Makai identifies as multiracial, and she's parenting a multiracial child. So she's going to share a lot of her personal experiences as we're going. So she might come right after me in a slide. She's also has some of her own slides she's going to take the lead on. And we're just going to talk through this together. So today, we're going to begin by talking about, well, first, I should say this course is based on our framework, Fostering Healthy Identity in the Early Years, that we published earlier, we published last year. You can scan the blue QR code to download the framework or visit dey.org to get a copy as well, too. And then the green QR code will give you access to the reflective workbook for this webinar. Now, this is a Google Doc, and when you access it, it's going to ask you if you want to make a copy because you can write in it. You can write your responses to the reflective questions, so you have to make a copy to access it. So just make a copy, save it to your own Google Docs, and then you'll have it and you'll be able to use it. So today we're going to begin by discussing what we mean when we say multiracial. Then we're going to discuss some of the contextual factors influencing multiracial development, and then that'll lead us into a very brief overview of the intersectional model of multiracial identity development. Then Makai is going to share her multiracial identity development journey and how she parents as a multiracial children and affirms multiracial identity in her classroom as an early childhood educator. And then finally, we'll conclude with some practical strategies, action steps, and resources for you guys. All right. So, multiracial or biracial or mixed are terms all used to describe people who come from parents that are not of the same race. Typically, we conceived of multiracial or biracial or mixed in the terms of black and white. This was really prominent during the era of enslavement, which we're going to talk about, and a lot of the laws that were passed to ban interracial marriages. But that has grown and since changed. There are fast-growing, all different types of multiracial folks, and then there's also multi-ethnic, right? And then there's also more than two, right? I'm in a couple groups for parents parenting adoptive children, and some of them talk about being the one parent is Mexican and black, and the other parent is Asian and white, right? So there you have four, right? Just in that one family, and then of course they're adopting children of other races as well too. So it's not just two, right? I use the term multiracial because it goes beyond just the idea of two, and we also want to go beyond our traditional concepts, right? So multiracial can include black and white and Asian, black and indigenous or native, white and Latinx, and so forth, right? All throughout. And then when we talk about ethnic, right? Multi-ethnic groups might be, you might have folks that are both considered Latino, and then we've talked about whether Latino is a race in the Latino webinar or not. But if you have someone who's like Mexican and Colombian, right, that might be considered multi-ethnic in a way. Other types of multi-ethnic groups might be folks from different countries, but in the same continent, right, in the same region and same area, but they have different ethnicities as well too. So between the census of 2000 and the census of 2010, the number of biracial Americans describing themselves as white and black more than doubled, and the number describing themselves as white and Asian increased by 87%. So this is the statistics from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And other conversations about race. She has a chapter on multiracial identity and talks about the numbers and the changes. I also found this graphic just to give you an idea. It's funny, they're talking about the growth of Hispanic and Latino in the graphic, but if you look, multiracial grew more than any other category from the 2010 to the 2010 census, right? White population actually declined. Asian grew slightly. Black seems to decline or stayed mostly the same. Hispanic grew, but multiracial grew more than that, more than any of the other groups. And part of that is the census allowing people finally to check multiple racial identity. So that changed the entire landscape once that happened as well, too. And then another quote from Tatum is in 2013, the U.S. Census Bureau found that 9 million Americans chose two or more racial categories to describe their race. So what we should give this information to let you know that maybe you work at a program and you're like, I don't have any multiracial people or biracial or mixed racial. They're out there. Maybe they're not in your program, but they're out there. Just like we did with when we talked about Asians and natives and Latinx folks, right? They're out there, and some programs are well represented and some are not. But they are a fast growing population and it's going to continue to grow. And so it's important to think about, right? How do you have multiracial people in your environment? And how do you know? How do you come to know that they're multiracial, right? Are they told to you? The parents tell you? Do they fill out forms? How do you get that information, right? Because I think part of it is visibility and awareness that we tend not to have about these people for different reasons. This comes up a lot, and I always say this in every session to remember that racial identity is two parts, right? It's internally constructed, how you identify yourself, and it's an externally imposed, how others perceive you. This is in the framework. This is a quote I got from the mnemonic, the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. had it on their website and some information they had. So that's important. So often people are perceived to be of one race. And so they're not even they're discounted as being multiracial. And so that's why you might think that, oh, you don't know many multiracial people because you perceive them to be of a different race than they actually are, right? And so it's important to just think about perception and how you come to find out how somebody identifies as well too. Anything there you want to add, Makai?
No, like I'm already taking like the points you've made and make sure I highlight them as I tell my
Perfect.
story. Yes,
All right, awesome. So the next part is thinking about contextual factors that influence multiracial development. And they influence a lot of parts of development, but it really comes through in the multiracial identity development theory as well too. So, in her book, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum states that in order to understand the contemporary meaning of claiming a multiracial identity, it is useful to review briefly the history of racial categorizations in the US, right? Because there's so much to think about and unpack with that identity, and then it impacts the child, right? Because they're in the current situation, but their parents who are part of some of these historical parts and their families, right? Grandparents who might still be around. All of that is kind of playing out as this child is developing as well, too. And so she goes on to discuss the one drop rule, which in both legal and social practice, anyone with known African ancestry, no matter how far back in the family lineage, was considered Black, while only those without any trace of known African ancestry were called whites. And she says that this practice solidified the boundary between Black and white. So again, this is during the time of American founding, during the enslavement of Africans, right? That this was a really important practice for them to distinguish, right? They brought in all these folks. They were enslaved for life, and they needed to, and there were some free blacks as well too, but they needed to really define whiteness based on who wasn't white, right? It became a very exclusionary thing. And so one other thing she says too is that the one drop rule applies only to blacks in the United States and to no other racial group in any other nation in the world, right? No other group does that. And so this is another really important fact that I like to throw in there, right? If you understand anything about Nazi Germany and what they were doing there, they were learning from United States in terms of racial segregation. And so one of the things, though, they were trying to decide in Nazi Germany was what to do with half Jewish people. And they thought that the American philosophy, the one drop rule, was too harsh. So Nazis thought it was a little too harsh to restrict. They weren't going to say, "Oh, you're half Jewish, you're half German, then you're fully Jewish and you can't be part of our society." They actually believe that someone who is half Jewish and half German could be brought into German society, right? And they thought Americans' one drop rule was too harsh, right? It was too harsh for Nazi Germany. And that's a point that I always want to drive home because I think it's important to think about in the context of how this developed and how it wasn't known around the world. It wasn't just accepted, right? That anybody who was mixed, right, had this idea. It was just reserved for Black people. Another contextual factor are laws prohibiting interracial marriage, right? And so how this might impact multiracial identity development. Until the Loving versus Virginia case, states in the United States regularly barred interracial marriage. And so it made the idea, the concept of a mixed or biracial child very taboo. And there are lots of stories during those times of people trying to pass, right? And so, again, thinking about how racial identity is internally, externally imposed, right? If you are perceived to be white, but you actually have a black parent, that was known as passing. If you then try to, use that perception of others to get back to get through in a racist system like Jim Crow era, right? So that's a big factor as well too. And but the taboo part was big. And so now there was a lot of generations where parents didn't want their child interracially married, right? Because they remember how it was treated in the past, right? And so they had to come to terms with that. So you might be dealing with a family that doesn't like accept or recognize or value the child that's multiracial or mixed, right, in the family because of these historical factors as well. And then again, as we already mentioned, the changes in the census, right? Being able to identify, being able to legally tell the United States government that you are multiracial, biracial mix is a huge, made a huge impact in how we came to understand who these people are, where they're living, right? The numbers and the different groups that they represent. And that's all coming out now in more census data since that change has happened. Some other factors or other factors that influence multiracial identity development are parental socialization and community demographics. So as I just mentioned, parents have different experiences, lived experiences around multiracial identity. And so how parents are socialized around race, culture, ethnicity greatly impacts how they're going to socialize their child. The primary parental figure in a child's life, which is typically the mother, but not always, right? But they have a great deal of influence over how their children come to see themselves racially. And so many mixed children, when we're talking, like say we're talking about what was one black parent, if the mother is black, they will likely more identify as black themselves than if the father is black and the mother is non-black, right? Because that primary socialization comes from the primary caregiver and it's typically the mother. And so it impacts a lot of that development as well, too. So understanding if you have a multiracial child, who are their parents? How do their parents identify? It's also super important to think about how that child is going to identify as well, too. Where multiracial children live also influences their identity development. Some grow up in predominantly diverse neighborhoods with other multiracial families as role models, while others grow up as the only mixed child living with a majority of one half of their identity. So if they're not living in a multiracial community, then they're typically living in a community that represents one of their parents, right? So if one of their parents is black, they might live in a predominantly black community, or if one of their parents are Latino, they might live in a predominantly Latinx community, and so forth, right? And so that is something to think about too, because are they going to see other children like themselves, right, who are multiracial and biracial? Are they going to have those racial mirrors growing up and see that as normal, right? Or are they going to feel very much like they are one and, they're ostracized for being the one mixed or biracial person in a community that's not mixed or biracial or that's heavily one side of their family. And so that's something to think about as well, too. Given the many contextual factors that influence multiracial identity development, intersectionality has become a key to understanding the process, right? So various social identities, including race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, and social class are going to have a strong influence on the racial identity development of a multiracial child, along with physical characteristics, right? We're talking skin color and other racial and ethnic features that will allow someone to perceive them as being a part of a group or not, or being in a group or not, right? It's like sometimes they want to claim an identity, but others are like, no, you don't fit that identity, right? And so that's based a lot on physical characteristics. And then lastly, stereotypes and discrimination against multiracial people are also a contextual factor to consider. The tragic mulatto is the historical stereotype that again came out of the era of enslavement when many white male slave owners were raping their enslaved black women and producing this class of mixed racial children who were back then termed mulatto. And so we see this come up in a lot of historical stories. They weren't white. Of course, the one drop rule kept them out of being white white and earning those privileges, but they were also not considered, fully Black as some of their other Black people that were living. And they also were treated differently, often, sometimes maybe given more privileges and things. And so it creates this wedge between the community as well, too. And we see that stereotype play out in lots of classic text literatures. And still to this day, people think that the children of who are mixed race and biracial don't do well. In Dr. Tatum's book, she has a whole section on that. Won't the children suffer? Because that's what a comment someone made to her one time about multiracial identity, is that the kids will suffer. And a lot of that comes from the tragic mulatto stereotype. Monoracism, which is a term I just learned preparing for this. That was something I hadn't heard before. So Dr. Victoria Maloney Brown defines monoracism as a social system of psychological inequality where individuals who do not fit monoracial categories may be oppressed on systemic and interpersonal levels because of these underlying assumptions and beliefs in singular, discrete racial categories. So this idea that you have to be really racially pure or single-raced or monoracial in order to then fit the norm of our racialized society, and that meaning that you have to be one race only. And so I understood this, like I knew it was a thing, but I didn't know it was a term, right? That it's like a form of racism to not accept people who are mixed race or biracial because they can't claim full identity into one racial group, right? And they're also the victim of discrimination based on that, right? And we've seen that. My situation is slightly different. In the other videos, I've talked about being born in Panama and not speaking Spanish, right? And so it comes from that part of it, the identity. My older sister, when we came to the United States, was about 10 years old. So she was older, she was fully fluent in Spanish, and she had a very hard time being accepted by other Black girls because they didn't see her as Black because she was kind of lighter skinned, but it's really because she spoke Spanish and she wasn't raised in America, so she didn't know American culture, right? So that could be this, that's just one example, but it's very similar. But it's that discrimination that you're not one of us because of whatever factor. This here is typically they're lighter skin, they are not fully accepted as being a part of the racial group, and so they experience that discrimination as well too. And I'm sure Makai is going to talk more about that as well too. So as you prefer to affirm multiracial identity in the early years, it's really important that you understand how these factors play a role in their identity development, and try and learn as much about your families as possible and try and get them to share as much. And sometimes families aren't really thinking about this. When I did a workshop just for parents on fostering racial identity development, one of the things that really shocked me was that when parents were like, and these were people again who are not identify as Black or white, right, but other types of racial groups. She's like, you want us to raise our kids to be proud, and we grew up trying to hide and be ashamed of who we are, and so now this whole new world is telling us to tell our kids, no, you're from Vietnam, and that's okay, and be proud of your Vietnamese heritage. And it was just shocking for her to like hear that that's good for kids, right? Because how she was raised, how her parents were raised in America was to minimize that part of your identity and to hide who you are. So we have to remember that now we're asking parents that we're trying to pull you out of that. Like that wasn't good for you. It wasn't good for your parents, and we don't want it for your child. And that's really hard for some of them to come around and accept, because they might be telling their kids, don't try to stand out as an Asian, just be you, just be regular, because that's how they themselves learn to be accepted in a society that didn't accept people who were different, or especially if they're biracial, right? Mixed racial as well
It's
too. So
survival.
it's survival, yeah, right. And I mean, she said that I was like, wow, I didn't even think about that. So yeah, I have to remember that a lot of this stuff we're asking parents to do is novel to them. They don't know what it's like. Like that wasn't done, or was done, but not in school setting. School was where the place where they tried to fit in and not be different. And now we're saying, let's affirm what makes you different. And so that's a huge thing that changes everything. So, all of these sessions, what we're trying to do is share a little bit about the racial identity development model for that particular group. So there are all of these theoretical models for all the different groups. Lots of psychologists, researchers studied and did these models. And so we want to share some of it with you, and then really think about what it means for young children, because a lot of these models start at adolescence and adulthood. They don't think about young children and their racial learning and how they're engaging in their racial identity development. But we know it's happening. So the intersectional model of multiracial identity development views identity as shaped by multiple overlapping factors, right? That intersectionality that we talked about: race, gender, class, etc. Recognizing that multiracial people experience unique challenges and privileges not captured by a single access model, focusing on the interplay of ascribed versus chosen identities within societal power structures like racism, sexism, to understand their complex journey of self-discovery, moving beyond simple one-drop rules to embrace holistic contextual self-definition. So again, here it's thinking about there's so much happening that we just talked about, right? Like all of their social identities are playing a factor, how they're perceived, how they identify themselves. What markers do they have of either of their or any of their racial identities or ethnic identities, right? And then all the other things we're talking about, geographically, where they're at, cultural attachment, right? I think when we blend race, ethnicity, and culture, we really think about what it means to develop an identity in terms of a very heavy cultural background. Like, how is that going to play on how you identify if, right, if you're only half of that culture, the way people want to assume, right? But that's maybe the culture you were fully raised in, fully spent all of your formative years in. So it doesn't feel like you don't feel like you're half of that culture. You feel like that is who you are, right? And so there's lots of factors here. What I love about this model is that it does take into account all of these things. I think some of the other models do too. I thought the Latinx model that did somewhat as well too, because they talked about orientations depending on how someone is oriented to their identity as a Latino person, and also the Asian American identity model as well, because it mattered again how they grew up. Were they in a white isolated community, predominantly white isolated community, or did they grow up in a predominantly Asian community? Right, all of those things factor. I don't think the Black identity model really gives enough nuance to intersectionality. It's working on it, but I think it's very limiting, and because it's kind of sees Black as a monolith, and I hope that it will take on a lot of this idea that all identity development is intersectional, right? Geography is a huge one for me for Black racial identity development, as I grew up in predominantly white spaces, and that hugely impacted my Black identity development. And so, opposed to someone who grows up in predominantly Black spaces as well too. So that's the model. And so now we're going to talk about Makai's going to share about her personal experiences as well, and her parenting and education because she works with young children and also does this with young children as well too.
Right. Thank you so much, Denisha, in defending the early years and everyone who's here tonight. Thank you. I'm a very visual person. I was like, if I put these pictures in, I'll be able to tell my story correctly, even though it's my story. I got to get the chronology together. But I was just thinking, like, overall, I just really wanted to name this slide The Ongoing Quest for Belonging. And I'll go through this, but I just really wanted to start with my parents, my wonderful parents. Um, my mom was born in Afghanistan, and my dad is a white American from New England, and he joined the Peace Corps, and he was tasked, like his job there was to teach English. And so just twist of fate, he walked through, an office and saw my mom and they met. And over time, because it was, they weren't allowed to really do anything there or communicate. But once he left, they continued like correspondence, and eventually they went and got married in India. And from there, they continued to travel. My dad, worked for USAID and other international organizations, and they finally settled in the United States. And I have an older sister and I have a younger brother, and so we were all born in the United States. I don't have a picture of my siblings. I said I have an older sister and a younger brother, and just growing up, so within our family, I didn't really feel I was enough. I didn't really know too much. I wasn't around my father's family a lot. They lived in New England, and it wasn't that many folks. But the majority of like my mother's immediate family did come to Washington D.C. So I was more around them. Um, and whenever I was introduced, I remember being told, like, oh no, she's not Afghan, she's American, like being, already labeled that like by family. I didn't speak the language fluently. You were speaking about language earlier. I tried, I guess, like in early childhood and in my childhood, but I was laughed at. I didn't say it correctly. I didn't, do it right. And so then I didn't really have any reason to try anymore, right? For those reasons. But my grandmother, my BB, she's in a picture here. Like she didn't speak English, so like in order to survive, I had to know what she was saying. So I was more understanding. Not much of a speaker, but I think that really matters in terms of feeling connected. Also, in terms of physical appearance, I'm the lightest out of my siblings. And so, colorism is everywhere. And I would get comments like, oh, you're so beautiful because your skin is lighter. Like that would be attached as a child, hearing things like that. But I'm like, no, but I want to match my mom. Like
Yeah.
I want to no, like why would you? And then even looking at my family that have darker skin saying that
Hmm.
to me, I'm like, but what does that mean if you're saying that about me? What do you feel about yourself? So it's a lot of, um confusion, I guess I would say, within that. And like even feeling jealous of my siblings because they could match and they belonged, right? Like if we were all together, like they looked like they were supposed to be there. Um, but I did want to also note that because my father did live in Afghanistan, did speak the language, knew the culture, I find that to be very meaningful in my upbringing, and that like I didn't ever experience any like friction between like having to hear one side say this about the other side and things like that. It was actually quite, cohesive in that sense. And then you were speaking about like potentially growing up in the community of one side or the other. No, I grew up in like an all black community. So I, third culture kid or, whatever you want to call it. And so I was raised in Southwest DC, predominantly black neighborhood, attended neighborhood schools through eighth grade. And throughout my childhood, I was identified as white. It was like, oh, if you're not black, you're white. And the kids, so that's like the externally imposed part of that. And then, but it was my dad, whenever we had forms to fill out, he would write Halfcan. He came up with that term and he always put that on our forms. Um,
Can I ask though, and I know it's different because it's, different. Do a lot of Afghan folks identify as white or?
I I don't know because I mean
Hmm.
I wouldn't
Okay.
say like I have done enough research to
Gotcha.
state
Okay.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure many do because it
Okay.
makes their life easier potentially. Like,
Sure.
because if you
Sure.
look
Sure.
at the history, I think it was like the Syrians in like the early 1900s, like when they immigrated, they're like, well, we'll just put white,
Yeah, of course.
because
Yes.
it'll make us,
Because it's better to be white.
yes.
Sure. Sure.
So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sure plenty do, but I mean, Afghanistan's a country in Asia. So
Yes.
we can go,
Okay.
I'll go into that a little bit too.
Yeah. Okay.
So Asian, would be the box if we're picking, boxes here. Um, and so like my friends knew like in my house we spoke Farsi, we ate Afghan food, we celebrated Muslim holidays, things like that. So like culturally, like that was in my home, that's what I experienced. Um, because my father was also, very much a part of that as well. Um, so and because my family never really explicitly talked about race with me, I just had to create my own understanding, like looking at the media, with my peers, whatever. So taking in, what people told me I was basically. And then, just throughout childhood, being forced into uncomfortable positions. For example, like what third grade, you start taking those standardized tests. And like when I was growing up, when I was in third grade, it was white, black, other. There was not the, multiple boxes to check. And I remember the first time saying, like, oh, I'm going to put other. And like over time, like internalizing that and what that meant to me. Also no one believing me if I was like, my mom is brown, I promise, like having those types of things, like and then also just the microaggressions again, like I said, within my family, like having to hear how I was different and being like explained like why I was different, constantly. So there's a lot of confusion. um and then the tables turned because I attended a predominantly white high school, a private school at that, in DC. Um, and so this was the first time affinity spaces were ever opened up to me, and I was like, great, I'll go to the Asian Student Association. And I go, and one guy was like, well, Afghanistan isn't Oriental enough. And I'm like, okay, don't belong here either, and another, sorry, don't belong again. But my freshman year is when 9/11 occurred. And that's, the rise in Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiment, like just all of that. And so I ended up joining the Arab Student Union, even though Afghanistan is not an Arab country, but everyone was lumping us, in all together. I was like, shit, well, we're experiencing the same thing. So let me go somewhere. And I'm truly grateful that they even, allowed me to join and participate in that, because we did have community together. So while I did have that community, I still did not belong, if that makes, any sense. Um, and then for when I was looking at colleges, my sister had went to Wellesley and I visited, and then I had another friend went to Bryn Mawr. I was like, oh my gosh, I really want to go to a women's university. Like I will be around people like me. It will be great. And it was. I went to Trinity, in DC. And I find like being in that space though actually is where my growth in becoming like unapologetic, um, really accepting my identity did occur. So I feel like being in that space did foster that. I will say that, even though it's a predominantly women of color program, but like I did feel safe in that space. And if you can go to the oh yeah, sorry, the pictures though. So that's me. Sorry if you went back one. Um, that's me. It was me in my elementary, like I would say like preschool, early childhood. I'm like, the only in my very Afrocentric garb. And then we have the very fancy schmancy graduation photo down there. But I chose the picture in the middle because I just felt like it was like a nice, not necessarily binary, but like, my Afghan dress with my Christmas tree kind of, symbolism right there. Next slide, please. So WPC. So I became an early childhood educator. And I've always been, my dad raised us, we went to Quaker meeting. I also had my Muslim side, but I really was drawn to the social justice aspect of like my moral compass. And so as I was an educator, we have professional development opportunities. And I found out about the White Privilege Conference, which is an annual anti-racism conference run by Dr. Eddie Moore. And so my first one, I think it was like 2014. I went, wonderful conference, and what they have scheduled. And I know I saw you there in like 2018. At the end of every day, there's time for caucus spaces, which is affinity spaces. And so they have a white anti-racist group, they have a BIPOC um, caucus, and then they also have a multiracial bi mixed heritage, group. And when I tell you that experience was the first time I felt like I belonged. The creation of the group itself came from years prior, where when it was caucus time, someone noticed it's just people in the hallway, and they were wondering like, wait, what's going on? They're like, well, I don't know. Do I go to this one? Do I go to this one? Where? And so Darlene Flynn, who is a lovely human being, she and another person that I'm blanking on right now. So they asked Dr. Eddie, they're like, hey, like we need this space. Like this space needs to be made because, this is what's going on. Like people are not able to like pick a side and things like that. And and it was perfect. And so I got to go my first year. Vanessa Roberts, who is a dear friend and mentor, opened up the space by asking us as an icebreaker, how do you respond to the question, what are you? And everyone in the group, identified differently, had different makeup in terms of, how they identified racially and their parents and things like that. And but as everyone spoke, like everyone was just like, yep, feel that way too sometimes. Yep. And and being in that space, like I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I didn't feel bad for expressing myself. And I truly felt like I belonged to a community. So like even though we were all different mixes, we had similar experiences, such as like being told what we were, having to prove our identity, forced to pick a side, had parents who never talked to us about like race or mixedness, being quantified, like you're a quarter, a half, a this, a third. Um, and so at the end of the conference, we're asked to like create an action plan, like to bring back to our communities. And so I thought about my experience with the caucus and I said, wouldn't it be amazing if I could create an affinity space for parents of multiracial children? A safe space where parents could discuss, their children and their experiences with race and privilege and oppression. And so it started out with the support of a few families. And like we met in, small world. I was like, tell me, what do you want to know? And like I had like this list of topics, and we started reading stories, and like I dove in. I was like, um, how would your child react to this? And like, what do you think they would go through or whatever? And like that was so silly of me, right? Like I learned it was silly of me to expect parents to be able to discuss race, racism, privilege, and oppression just because they had multiracial kids, right? That was I was like, oh, oops, I needed to go like 10 steps back. And so what I did, I shifted the meetings to start with their experiences, right? Like the saying goes, like you have to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help someone else. And so I included identity work exercises. So like each meeting we would have like an identity work exercise, such as like the power shuffle. Oh, right up here in the corner. That's when we were doing the power shuffle. And like you could see there's a parent all the way in the back. And there was a white dad. I had to go in the front, open the door so he could keep going forward. Okay. Like that. So it was, and it was plenty of parents because like my school, growing number of interracial families, multiracial children. Um, and then also like here's an example below. I don't know if you know the 6-word story exercise. And so I had them think about and reflect on their experiences with their racial socialization growing up. And they came up with 6-word stories, which were really powerful, really powerful. And so while we do those things, we also end with considering the ways in which their child will or will not have, that type of experience and what that means and how that makes them feel and things like that too. So like my goal was, I want the parents to lean on each other. I want them to be mindful of the belonging that their children will be seeking, similar to me, like throughout their lives potentially. I want them to think now while they're children, like my school now is 12 months to 5 years. At that time, it was like maybe two, we expanded over time, but really in early childhood, like start thinking about this now. Like don't wait until like an incident happens, later on when they're in school or even earlier. But just to um, be able to thoughtfully engage with their children in navigating their mixed identity, basically. But they can't do that until they do it, for themselves. And so now, after they're, thinking about how their racial identities have impacted their lives and reflect on messages received growing up about race, um, we're hoping, they can support their children because their child might experience something that they've never experienced. And so now something new that I included starting last year was I'm inviting, because now this has been going on for actually, yeah, about 10 years now, 10 years or so. I'm inviting a former family to come back, or a parent to come back and share their experience now that their child has, grown a bit, and be a resource that way, and share that insight. Next slide, please.
And
So
see,
actually,
okay, good.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
So this was introduced to me my first caucus meeting, and I include it in the first meeting with my families every year. The caucus also exposed me to a lot of language, like you were talking about, like monoracism. I learned about hypodescent, which is the one drop rule, and learned about Maria P.P. Rude, who started a lot of this research on mixed identity. There's also another resource, and I'll add all these resources. I'll give them to Denisha too, like the 50 most common experiences of people who identify as mixed race. But this is I find to be like, just when I read it, like, it's pretty powerful. Where it's like, oh, there's language for what I've been feeling my whole life. This is amazing. So having this type of research out there and like creation of things like this is really impactful. And it helps the families too see another perspective of things. Next slide, please. And so now I have a 6-year old. My husband is Black, Black American. And so we have our own multiracial child. And so I just chose these photos to, like, give me some visuals to go through, with you all. But really, we already were talking about this, prior to her being born, in terms of really wanting to develop a positive sense of self. Um, and then of course, like once she was born, and like we got a sense of like her physical appearance, like really understand excuse me, appearance, understanding she's going to experience colorism, she's going to experience racism, and she's going to experience sexism. Like this, we have already understood this. And so in terms of combating, we can say, but also preemptively, supporting her. We are very intentional of the books that we provided to her. So, for example, I love Shades of Black. It's, I'm sure there are others similar, but I love Shades of Black because it shows that there is no one way to be Black or look Black, and that there's differences in skin tones, eye color, hair texture, etc. So, like, we started reading that when she was like a baby, and still have it, available. And she'll read it, now that she can read, reads that all the time. Um, all the Colors We Are is a great book because it discusses the science behind skin color. So like you understand like what is melanin. I like that they say, like, in families where parents are different colors, like sometimes the kids match, sometimes they don't, sometimes they're in between, so just some language like for children. I use that in my classroom all the time, especially for like self-portraiture and conversations about race. And then this book over here, I had to dig and research because Dari is the language that my mother speaks. Is different from Persian, in some senses. So I had to find specifically Dari books that are translated for her so she can see it in text and have access to that. And my mom could read it to her, which is really amazing. And then of course, like as we were talking about, and Denisha speaking on like the whole idea of like, don't put me in a box. So we don't, you, and the quantification too. That's why I put the pie chart. It's like we say and, we don't say half, we don't say quarter, we don't say, it's just, oh yeah, you're this and this and this and this. Isn't that awesome? Like we're very mindful of that. But of course, as we know, like how she identifies might change over time, right? Like, and that's okay. But right now we're giving her the opportunity to be able to express herself, understand herself, that like she's part of all of it. She is not excluded, from any of it. Like she's part of all of it. And of course, like as you get into like, of course, learning about race, and you get into racism as well. And our skin is the most, like, hands down, like one of the best tools that you can have when introducing racism. Like it has great language information for adults to use as well. So she's been reading that since she's been like 1.5 as well. And then I included Don't Touch My Hair because um her gender identity, she identifies as a girl, and also the fetishization that comes with being a mixed girl is, I mean, it's there, and also the touching of hair and things like that. And so I just included that as an example of how we've started that conversation as well, pretty early, about consent and, you know, setting boundaries with people. And so I'm very pleased at this point. She has not explicitly expressed like placing value of any parts of herself over the other. She's, you know, able to, and I know this is not the same for everyone, but she spends time with a lot of her family, my family and my husband's family. Um, I was joking, like she can do traditional Afghan dances at weddings, and she also does all the line dances at the cookouts. You know, she's able to do it all. And we really try to make sure she spends time with everyone that can support her in developing a positive racial identity. And so I was telling Denisha this too, like a month ago, she had a friend tell her, a black friend tell her, like, you're not black. And she was like, and I said, what did you say? Like when she said that, and she's like, oh, I said, yes, I am. And I said, what else happened? She's like, oh, that was it. So, you know, kids, you know, like it doesn't have to go that deep, like right now. But I was very proud of her that she asserted herself and her identity to her friend.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And thank you for sharing so much. It's super important. I have like so many stories popped in my head as you were talking, right? But I remember teaching kindergarten in Washington, D.C., and we had a student who was biracial, black and white. And for the longest time, just her dad, I think, her black dad would come and pick her up because her mom was also a teacher at another school and not nearby, so she could never come during dismissal time. So dad would come. But one time mom came and the kids freaked out. They're like, I'm like, Jordan, your mom's here. They're like, don't let Jordan leave with that strange white lady. That's not her mother. And I was like, yes, it is. Like they had just never met her, right? So the kids very much, but once they were like, Jordan's like, no, this is my mom. And they were just, they didn't, they just saw her with her black dad and black, and they just did not even understand that she was biracial or mixed race until her mom came. And so I thought that was really interesting that they weren't even perceiving her to not be black because she had a black dad, right? And so it's very interesting. I think kids like, yeah, and like you said, but once we told them that, and they were like, oh, okay. And it wasn't fine. They didn't need a long conversation. They were just like, they thought a stranger was taking her. And I was like, that's her mom. And they're like, that's your mom? And she's like, that's my mom. And they're like, oh, okay. And so yeah, kids don't, you know, they don't understand right away, and it's so important. And then also to your point earlier about the way people talk to you about being lighter skin and the privileges. I have a friend who Costa Rican, and she had two daughters, and one was light skin and one was dark skin. Same mom, same dad, right? And so she grew up her whole child's life watching her light skinned daughter being treated differently than her dark skinned daughter, and so very much like influenced and shaped, right, how her understanding of all of that, because she could see it in the way that family members, not just outsiders, but family members treating what the one daughter over the other because she was light skinned, because she had those different features. And I'm glad you mentioned colorism because I forgot to bring that up as part of the racism and discrimination, right? And colorism is a huge issue. Within a lot of groups, but especially multiracial people, right? Because if they're perceived to be lighter, right, then what they're than other folks, right, then they're going to receive different types of privileges, and then also discrimination from folks who don't like that, right? Don't like that you're being perceived better in that sense as well, too. So there's so much going on, and I'm so happy that you were able to start that group and continue that work. 10 years, it's super important. So, of course, you jumped at the chance to do this when I reached out, and I'm so happy you did. Well, we want to share with you some practical strategies for educators and caregivers, and even parents as well too. So first, you know, really try and use inclusive identity language, right? Reflect the language families and children use to describe themselves, and model phrases like all parts of who you are matter. So like Makai said, don't use half, right? Most people don't use half. I'm the only child that was born of my mother and father, but I don't call any of my siblings half. I grew up with the siblings of my mom's side, so there were five of us. I would never consider them half, right? We grew up together for my entire life, and then I met my dad's family when I was 17, and but again, I don't call them half either because, yeah, I say that you know they grew up with my dad, I grew up with my mom, right? But that's not the language we use, and so I think you need to find out the language that your families use and try and use it. And of course, if now I will say there are times when people bring language that is problematic. I used to teach a course at Howard University, and we had a lot of Saudi Arabian students come in. And and they didn't know, like they would use terms like colored and things like that. So I'd have to be like, oh, we don't use that language anymore. So you might have a family that's using outdated terms. Like mulatto is actually not a term that we use in for people anymore. So I should have said that earlier when I mentioned it. That's not a term that most people like. Some people are offended by mixed or biracial, but you really just want to figure out how people refer to themselves and use that if it's appropriate, right? For the children as well too. Curate multiracial representation, include books, dolls, photos, and stories that show multiracial families and children in everyday, joyful, and complex ways, right? And so we've seen a lot of this. I think I've noticed in watching commercials on television that there's been a huge increase in multiracial representation, biracial families and TV, to the point that it's gotten some backlash. Like I've heard people saying now that like the colorism is coming in, like dark skinned people or people who are like dark skinned black people can't get roles because they're all going to biracial mixed people. So it's the pendulum swings is what I'm saying, right? But you want to make sure that multiracial kids, and not just black and white, because again, it's more than that, right? But they are represented in the books, in the curriculum materials as well too, so that students can see them. And that racial mirroring that I mentioned earlier is super important, right? Do kids see themselves represented in the school, in the classroom, in the community? We already know they don't see themselves represented in their family because they're a mix of two or more. So they're already standing out there. So they need that representation in the classroom. Interrupt what are you moments. Gently but clearly step in when adults or children try to label or categorize a child based on appearance. So I have a friend. His name is Sergio. He has a very Latino first name, last name. We were all hanging out, and this young girl who had just met him said, "Hey, where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Texas." And she goes, "Oh, where are your parents from?" And he said, "Texas." And she's like, "Well, where are your—" And I stopped her. I said, "Sweetie, you want an answer that he's not going to give you because he traces his entire lineage back to Texas and not Mexico, which is what you want to hear." And she was like, "Oh, I didn't mean no. I get it, but the going on, the furthering, keep asking them, it's really rude, and people need to just stop doing that." I met a girl one time. She was Asian, Southeast Asian. And I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Texas." And I said, "What part?" And she didn't realize I said what part because she's used to having to be like, "I'm from Texas." Because most people, and she goes, "Oh, no one ever says that." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "No one ever asked me what part of Texas. They asked me, where are you from, really?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not one of those people. What part of Texas are you from? Houston, Austin, Dallas, right?" So it's important. They rarely get those experiences. Typically, people are forced to answer that question, "Where are you from? What are you?" over and over and over again. And so we want to help kids to say, there's fine to ask someone, "Where are you from?" But you have to accept the answer that they give you. And what are you? We are human beings. So that doesn't really fly. And that really was encapsulated in the movie Sinners. There's a woman who has black in her, she's in the one drop rule. She's got black in her. And I think she said her mother's father was black. So not even like, I don't, but she, presents as a very white person, could be white passing. And someone's like, "What are you?" And she's like, "I'm a human being." Right. And so we know what you're trying to mean, but we want to help kids think about how better to say that. Where are you from? How do you identify, right? And things like that, but not this question about what are you? We want to honor family stories, invite families to share their cultural, racial, and language histories in ways that celebrate complexity rather than neat categories, right? So letting families come in, not just for food and festivals, but really different things that you might be talking about. And you get to know families to know that, right? Like, um, right? When grandparents are around, aunts and uncles who maybe lived in another country and now live here, like having them be able to come and talk with the kids about those experiences are really helpful as well too. Teach children that identities can be many and changing. Use conversations, play, and storytelling to reinforce that people can belong to more than one group and still be whole. The logical nature of children's brain makes categorization really, really important. Think about their development, right? They very much need things to be black and white, right? I always love the concept of like when a child first learns what a dog is, right? In their mind, they're like, "Oh, a dog, it's got four legs, it's got a tail, it goes woof woof, it's got a fur, that's a dog." And then they meet a cat, and now they got got to expand what they come to know as dog because all those things apply, but a dog is not a cat and a cat is not a dog, right? So this is constantly happening in children's brains, right? So they know a person to be of one group and another group, and now you're telling them to create a new category for something called mixed and biracial. They can do it, but they need support, right? Because it goes against their logical brain and wanting to categorize everything as one or something. So the more time you spend with stories, with materials, with experiences, they'll get it and they can totally learn to accept it, but they need that opportunity. And early childhood is the perfect place for them to understand, right? That people come and from different families and that they're, mixed race, multiracial families exist and this is how we get them. And again, using the books that Makai mentioned that talk about melanin and skin color and all of those things so they can understand the science behind it will really help them as well too. And then lastly, challenge monoracial norms and systems, right? Advocate for school reforms, data systems, and classroom practices that allow families to reflect more than one racial identity. And so I think that affinity group story is the perfect place. People don't know where to go because you haven't created the right affinity group that can put them in one. And so that's definitely something to think about. And then, if your school is predominantly one major racial group, what are you doing to make sure that the people who are mixed race and biracial feel a part of that group, especially your environment, you were Afghan and white, not black and in Black Fairy, Black DC. So it's a very different experience, right? But it's something to think about for all of the students as well, too. How do we challenge monoracial norms and get students to think outside, right, of just the one drop rule or just that there can only be one way of being any type of racial group or racial categorization? So we have some call to actions for each of our sections in the reflective workbook, but we always like to end with one. And so we want you to just remember that multiracial children are not confusing, incomplete, or in between. They are whole. Your role is to protect the right to be fully seen, fully named, and fully affirmed. Just like the rights that I shared, I had never thought those before, and I thought those were great. Right? It's our job to remind people that they're okay. There's nothing wrong with them and who they are, and that we want to normalize and affirm their place in the world and society and help other students to learn that as well too. And remember that we're not being socialized that way. So a lot of what we're doing here is interrupting the socialization that's happening because the cycle of socialization is very negative, right? And so we want to interrupt that by normalizing folks and affirming who they are and letting other students see what we're doing so that they can understand that. So after this webinar, choose one place in your classroom, home, or school system where monoracial thinking shows up. Then take one step to change it, whether it's a forum, book, conversation, or a routine. Your action helps create a world where every child's full identity is welcomed and sorry, I'm missing that last part, and honored, right? And so that's very something to think about, just little actions about how you can do. And if you see those things popping up, I particularly deal with this again because my children are Colombian American, Afro-Colombian American. So they look black just like me, and they are, but they also are Colombian, born and raised there, speak fluent Spanish. And so they get a lot of pushback on whether they're black enough. So they're too black for Spanish groups. I feel like if they went to college in the United States, this would come up a lot when they would try and join affinity groups. Like black people would say, "Oh, you speak Spanish, you're not really black," and then Spanish people say, "Well, you're not, you're too black to be Spanish," and they would be stuck in that in between. And a lot of Afro Latinx identify with that, right? They feel stuck in the middle of those two spaces, and so challenging that monoracial thinking in Black Americans, right? That yes, like you can't deny, right? They're still black. They're still going to be perceived as black by anyone on the street. They're only Latino to them when they open their mouth, right? And so that's how the perception and the intersectionality plays out. And so I do have to take steps to challenge that around. Fortunately, in my family, we were pretty good about that because we grew up with a lot of Panamanians who were black. But for some people, they don't know. When I would tell people I adopted children from Colombia, they just assumed my kids were not black. They didn't know black people lived in Colombia, right? There's this is not a lot of people know that black people exist all over the world. So you have to help like bring awareness to that as much as you can, so that they can understand, right, the lived realities of others.
Can I add,
Yes, please
just
do.
quickly? If you're asking your kids, your students to provide family photos, you should have one as well if, as an educator. I
Yes,
think
yes.
having your family photo visible in the classroom is very powerful. And that's where like I find myself being very supportive to conversations about race and like, family structure even is by being an example and being able to tell the story of my family, and it opens the door for like other kids to share the story of their family as well.
Yes, yes, I love that. Having that is super important. I have, my sister, my oldest sister, I told you about before, a little lighter than I. Her husband before he passed away, he was black, very light skinned, right? And so my nieces, like, someone didn't believe. I just had someone looking at the picture, and they're like, "Who's that baby?" I'm like, "That's my great nephew," and they're like, "They can be related to you." So my niece grew up very, very light skinned, and then had a baby with a white man, and so her son looks just like her father did when he was little, like very pale, light skin. But like when I hold him, people are like, I'm like, that's my great nephew. That's my so like, having those pictures around for kids to see that like even someone as dark as me has very light skinned people in my family, right? And they're still there. And so it helps people to understand and see like, oh wow, okay, because they'd be surprised. And actually when my niece got married, a lot of her they were shocked. They always assumed she was mixed race, and I said no. Both of her parents were black. They're just light, very light skinned, right? And I've also had that issue one time where I was talking to a guy who I assumed was biracial because he was very light skinned, and he said, "Well, I'm going to get married to a white woman, and my kids are going to be half white." I said, "Don't you mean two quarters or something more?" Because I thought he's like, "I'm not." Half white, I'm black. And I was like, oh, and then it reminded me, right, that even sometimes I forget, right, that light-skinned people can both be black or mixed race or different things. So having those photos, showing kids and letting them tell you who they are without assuming, it's super important. So we have some resources as well too. And so the Padlet of resources will have all of these, but you can also click on them when you get the slides and they'll take you to the link. So how to talk to multiracial kids about race is a news article I found. How cute is he yours is a podcast recording about Black women and other talking about being assumed to be the nanny when they're with their biracial child. I think in every one of these webinars, we have shared something from Embrace Race because they are a powerful organization. They did a two-part Raising Multiracial Children, part one, examining multiracial identity. That's when I learned the definition of mono-racism. And then part two, Raising Multiracial Children, part two, anti-Blackness in multiracial families, which I think is super, super important. So I hope you check those out. You can read the entire transcript and also watch the videos, and they have resources there. And then how multi-ethnic people identify themselves is an NPR recording and article as well too. So all of these will be included in the Padlet. You can also access them directly from the slides. And so lastly, we just want to share you again with what's coming up in the rest of this course. So this is our fourth, well, we did an introductory one. So this is our fifth webinar. And so we have two left to go. On February 2nd, we're doing Affirming Black African American Identity in the Early Years. This is taking place during the National Black Lives Matter School Week of Action. So it is open to all and not just our subscribers. And so hopefully we'll have a nice, good turnout. And then our last one is just for subscribers. We're ending with Affirming Healthy White Identity in the Early Years. And our guest speaker is Kirsten Cole, and that's going to be on March 16th. And then Takima Bunch Smith is joining me February 2nd for the Affirming Black and African American Identity. So thank you all so much for joining. We hope you download the workbook. There's great reflective questions. Again, you have to make a copy of it and save it as a Google Doc. And we hope to see you at the next webinar on February 2nd. Thank you so much, Makai, for sharing all of your information and resources as well, too.
Thanks for having me.